Hello, welcome to the University of Brighton podcast. I'm Richard Newman. This is episode 111 of the podcast, which talks to academics, staff and students about their work. There's loads in the back catalogue, so if you're new to this, do check it out. My guest this week is Dr. Daniel Burdsey, Deputy Head of School for Research in the School of Sport and Service Management. Dan's research focuses on the sociological and geographical analyses of ethnicity and popular culture, and his latest monograph, Racism and English Football for Club and Country, has just been released. Thanks for coming on, Dan. There's lots to get stuck into about football and racism, but let's just get to know you a little bit better first. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your work at the university?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Really appreciate the invitation to join the podcast today. I joined the university in 2004, where I joined what was then known as Chelsea School, based out in Eastbourne, and I joined there as a lecturer teaching on the sport studies and sport management programs. And over those 16 years, I've now progressed. So I'm now, as you said in your introduction, the Deputy Head of School in the School of Sport and Service Management, with responsibility for research and enterprise. And my research over that time focuses on, as you say, the sociological and cultural geographical analyses of race and racism as manifest in popular cultural spheres. A lot of that has been around sport, primarily, and within that, a predominant focus on football. But I've also spent quite a lot of time writing about the English seaside and how that's a kind of repository of notions of whiteness and exclusion and racism. So there's the overarching sort of theme is racism and popular culture, and within that, two topics very close to my personal life as well as my professional one, football,
yeah.
And the seaside.
Sure. Where does that interest come from?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really important sort of frame, or the way I try and talk about my research, is that my own personal anti-racist politics are derived in many ways, not from the books I've read or engaging with the work of sort of leading thinkers on the topic. That came afterwards. My interest in these topics, the anti-racist politics, very much sort of generate from the ground up, if that makes sense. I try and make that clear in what I write, that my interest in whether that be football or the seaside are generated from my experiences in those cultural spheres. And as I say in this this latest book on racism and football, it is written as an academic, and hopefully there's enough in there to sort of interest fellow sociologists and students of that topic. But it's also very much written from experiences as a fan and a participant in football. I'm very much a believer in what C. Wright Mills dubbed the sociological imagination, where we combine not only our sort of intellectual understanding and theoretical framing, but with our personal experiences and our personal biographies. So my point about coming to where my sort of interest developed from, I've kind of retrospectively been interested in the ideas and the sociological framing of these cultural phenomena, but it's very much within the lived experience of someone who grew up loving football and loved going, was born at the seaside and loved being at the seaside, that really generated my interest, because it wasn't long, in experiencing those things, both football and experiencing seaside cultures, that I started to realise that these things weren't accessible for all. And there were, the kind of inequities and exclusions which, we recognise in other areas of life, were also very present in these areas of popular culture, which I was enjoying.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's get into the book and talk about English football and racism. Loads to talk about. I think we'll start with some fan culture, and I think it kind of comes back to what we've just been talking about sort of experiences that you sort of witness in football, issues in the stands. And I think anyone who's been to a football match can probably remember at least one incident where a spectator around you may have said something racist. And now it's a lot easier to report, so you don't experience it maybe as much because people can be caught easier. But it feels like it has crept in a little bit more in recent years. For example, we saw Raheem Sterling being racially abused at Chelsea a couple of years ago. Fan was banned for life in that. When we see that, do you think it's sort of that's reflecting society in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you say there about experiences of we've all been to games and witnessed those racist episodes. It is a really sad kind of well, it's more than a footnote. It's been a central sort of part of the canvas of my life of supporting football. I remember hearing and seeing these things in the 80s and 90s, and I still see them now. That was a big kind of thing I talk about in the book is recognizing that these things haven't drifted away. They didn't go away. They've been here all along, and that's something which is obviously very, very much known by those individuals who experience who are on the end of those discriminatory comments. I mean, I think it is appropriate at one level to think about how football reflects society, but I would, and I'm working through a lot of this with my students at the moment, is to think about that actually football's more than a reflection of society. Football is part of society. It's quite common knowledge to think about sport as a sort of microcosm of society, but that sometimes gives sport almost a sort of free pass, that it's a kind of innocent receptacle by which wider issues of race and racism are sort of forced into. But that is a common way of thinking about it. I mean, with the issues in the last couple of years, that's been a very common way of thinking and talking about racism in football, from media pundits, from ex-players, that racism is a social problem and it kind of pops out in football, in that kind of environment. Now, I think it's important to say that, there's certainly evidence that football does reproduce broader forms of societal racism. There's no doubt about that. We saw that post 9/11, where there was a real upsurge in overt Islamophobic discrimination on the terraces in football. And as Gary Neville, the Sky Sports pundit, who sort of emerged as a sort of champion for social justice from sort of nowhere, was saying, I think earlier this year, there's no doubt that the Brexit culture, or the Brexit mechanisms and the discriminatory mechanisms of that are reproduced in football. And I would add that the wider discriminatory immigration climate around the hostile environment is also very, very present within that. But I would also say that there's a danger in thinking that ideas of racism come from society into football, and only working in that direction, from society into football. Because actually football is generative of its own problematic racist practices and racist meanings and racist ways of thinking and talking as well. And it's really important that we recognise both, that society does influence football, but also what happens in football can also have meanings and repercussions and outcomes which then generate into the wider society. And if we ignore the latter, to an extent, we kind of let football off the hook, and it allows people in football to perhaps argue that, well, kind of, it's simply a cultural realm or an industry which is reproduced in wider social relations. Of course it is, but we also must hold football account and recognise football's own responsibility and contribution to this.
Well, with that in mind, has enough been done really? Because there's often the question about whether football is institutionally racist. And I recently did an interview for another podcast with Chris Ramsey, the technical director at QPR, former Brighton defender. He believes it is. He believes that a lot of the things that are being spoken about are mostly lip service only. And when he looks back really about what has really been achieved over the past few decades, he doesn't really think enough's been done. So do you think that is the case?
Yeah, I'd be absolutely in agreement with that. That's a sort of the common. Well, I would like to think the common feature of my scholarship over the last 20 years, if I include my PhD studies on this, which has been a very critical appraisal of what happens in football and the inadequate response by football's authorities, governing bodies, clubs, etc., to that. I think the term institutional racism has a kind of people are aware of that term post Macpherson inquiry, and I think it has some benefits, but I would probably prefer to use terms which are more common within the sociological literature of perhaps systemic racism and or structural racism. I think they're important because they help us to understand that it's not just in the institutions where racism exists, and of course it does exist in those institutions, but it also exists in the processes and the procedures and the actions. It is what it says. It's in the structures and the systems, whether that be about recruitment of players, whether that be about selection of coaching staff, whether that be in kind of sociological ideas of belonging and feeling included in the stadium. So I think I would tend to use or employ ideas of structural and or systemic racism, and in doing that, yes, I would say that characterises what football unfortunately is.
Yeah, and I think we recently saw, when we're talking about structures in football, we recently saw obviously that the chairman of the FA, Greg Clark, he had to resign for using some pretty archaic comments when speaking to MPs. And now I don't really think there's a general feeling that people are actually accusing Greg Clark of being racist, but certainly a lack of understanding and education on what is and isn't acceptable to say and treat people as well. So when the person at the top of the game in this country is saying those things, what does that say about the organisation of football and the problems that have to be sorted?
Yeah, I heard a really interesting, I think it was a caller on 5 Live who had sort of juxtaposed what Greg Clark has said to someone else making a similar comment, and they came to the conclusion, quite rightly, that when you're the head of the Football Association, you cannot make these mistakes. You cannot do this, and there's no room for error. And it's to have you used the term archaic, which I think is absolutely an appropriate description. To have someone who is the head of a huge organisation, which is relatively diverse in its participant base. That's absolutely not acceptable. Not acceptable for someone to be speaking in that language. And let's not forget, it wasn't one slip. It was I think 3 or 4 comments which were racist, homophobic, sexist in their articulation and content. But we shouldn't see this as just a one-off. Greg Clark, his record hasn't been great for quite a while. He was heavily involved as the head of the FA in the complaint which Eniola Aluko made about her racist treatment by the manager Mark Sampson in the England women's setup and the fellow coaches. And let's not forget that was a complaint which was the FA tried to bury. They tried to dismiss it. They tried to present Aluko as kind of the risky black woman who was rocking the boat and didn't know her place and wasn't was making it, in their eyes, an illegitimate complaint. And his involvement in that, both the procedure and the actual Department for Culture, Media and Sport inquiry, was appalling. And Aluko was rightly, her complaint was upheld. So there's a backstory here, but I think it's also important to think that Greg Clark isn't alone. There's not just one Greg Clark. There are lots of people like this at the higher levels of British sport. There's an article in the Telegraph, a really nice infographic in the summer, which I use with my students, which shows that the people in power in British sports governing bodies are nearly exclusively white and nearly exclusively male. And this is, what Chris Grant, who's a really very high-ranking, influential black sports administrator, was saying in the summer. This is, in many ways, the problem of our times. Of course, there are other problems in sport, but it's what professional players are talking about. We've had people like Romelu Lukaku, Vincent Kompany, talking about what they see as a problem is that people in positions of power are simply not aware of what it's like to be a black footballer, male or female. And they're not arguing that, it's impossible to know that. There of course, one can be empathetic and supportive if you're not part of, a group who are racially abused. And that's what I try and do in my research. I'm a white academic. I don't experience racism. I accrue the privileges of whiteness, but I try and, act as an ally and as a scholar of racism. But this is what these players were saying. There's people in the highest positions of sports governance who are, not aware, to put it mildly, ignorant perhaps of the lived experience of being a sports person of colour.
How important is it then that the FA gets the next appointment right?
Well, it's absolutely critical. It's absolutely critical. I keep referring to what I do with my students, because hopefully it comes across that, this is obviously the other part of my job, which I love just as much. And it's so nice to be able to talk about your own research and your current ideas with your student cohort. And I've been talking to my third year class on racism in sport and popular culture module, and talking about how we weigh up the significance of 2020, which, in my years of studying racism, is undoubtedly perhaps the most important year in my lifetime in terms of those sorts of developments, but also putting that in a broader historical context and understanding, we've had other important years, 1968 or what have you. And thinking, but I think it's a critical time. It's an opportunity to appoint someone who is forward-thinking, is aware of the issues. But I would also want to suggest that this goes beyond Clark or whoever is promoted to the position of the head of the FA, because as critical race theorists would suggest, reflecting on, for example, the appointment of President Obama, you can have powerful people, in that instance, a black man in powerful positions, but it doesn't necessarily change every element of that society or that structure or that industry. So absolutely, the appointment of the head of the FA, it's perhaps the most important decision the FA are going to make in this era. But it doesn't stop with the appointment of the chair. It's about the broader cultural values of the institution.
Sure, and then hopefully it will filter down to the game, because you look at the top level of football for the opportunities for black coaches, especially in management. That looks to be really difficult. How long have we been having this conversation? There are so few black coaches in prominent roles. You can count them on, two hands in management. You've got the QPRs mentioned just now. They've got Les Ferdinand and Chris Ramsey in big positions. Chris Hughton's at Nottingham Forest, Nuno Espirito Santo at Wolves, and there really are just a few others. Does it fit into that same conversation then about the game being with systemic racism? And is that basically only those routes being blocked only by a very actually small minority of the people who are running the game, who aren't giving them opportunities, whereas actually there's a huge desire to get more diversity in the game in general.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that you mentioned the issues around coaches and managers. So likewise with the governance and the leadership, I think it's a really, really fundamental sort of pivot point for where football goes next. And it's interesting because the football industry as a whole, I'm talking quite broad brushstrokes here, has often been it's often sort of utilized what we might call particular mechanisms of denial, denying that there's racism in football. And one of the ways in which football and associated politicians or the media have sought to deny the issue of racism is to say, well, look at the percentage of black footballers, look at the percentage of people working in the game. But when you break that down and then you analyze football in terms of its different sort of realms and levels, you soon find that there are very sort of few few elements of professional football where people of colour are employed. One of those, most obviously, is as players, and the other is as stewards, match stewards, and as people working in the service sector, providing refreshments in professional football stadia. And we can see that these are quite embedded colonial sort of limited roles and stereotypes, that it's the black folk that entertain and serve the white customers, if you like. So there's a real unevenness in sort of inclusion throughout football. And that helps us to understand this issue around coaches and managers, because again, the kind of mechanisms of denial will say, well, it can't be about racism because there are so many players. And that's sort of a teachable moment, and work through with students to say, well, actually, this is how racism works. Racism can be sort of inconsistent. It can pick different elements, different times. Racism works by allowing or facilitating the inclusion of perhaps one racialized community and not the other. But it also can work by including a particular minority ethnic community in one aspect of an industry or profession and not others. So we can see that players, and for example, African Caribbeans have historically been racialized as, in inverted commas, natural sports people who make good footballers. But the same sort of racist logic has racialized African Caribbeans as not having the kind of cerebral or leadership qualities which people would see to be required to manage a football club. So absolutely, I think the exclusion of coaches of colour in the men's and women's game, the women's game, the representation is even lower, is absolutely part of that systemic problem I allude to.
Yeah. The Black Lives Matter movement, that was well marked in football. And as we record this, players are continuing to take a knee before kickoff. But what's the next step? Because is it going to become so normalized that the real reason for it, to raise awareness, just starts to get lost? It's maybe starts to become a bit more of a routine. I think when this came in, there was a bit of criticism from some players. I'd like to think it might be someone like Andre Gray, an interview that I read, that taking a knee or wearing a T-shirt to highlight a campaign, for example, for Kick It Out, isn't really enough. It's a bit of a box-ticking exercise.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of debate around the sort of wearing of T-shirts in the anti-racist week of action, and the last 5 years ago, we've seen a lot of high-profile players, black and white, saying, look, we're not wearing the T-shirts. I mean, that's partly related to the episode between Anton Ferdinand and John Terry, which it led to Anton's brother Rio and others saying, we didn't feel that organisation was sufficiently supportive. But yeah, it's a really important debate to have, and I was really interested in Les Ferdinand's comments recently, that he was someone in particular who was saying that he felt that the taking the knee at the start of the game is sort of losing its power. It kind of becomes part of the institution of starting a football match, as much as the fair play handshake and the playing of the kind of Premier League anthem. But I think, and again, this is what I would try and work through with my students, is that it's these things are never an either or. Trying to get away from what we call binary thinking, that it's either a good thing or it's a bad thing. I'm someone who's critical of the way in which sort of dominant institutions, particularly in football, could often articulate or demonstrate a form of multiculturalism, stroke sort of diversity rhetoric, which is very superficial. It can be reinforcing stereotypes. It's kind of for the benefit of themselves. And this, again, this is what critical race theorists would argue is an example of what they call interest convergence, where things which can seem to be forms of progress for communities of colour are only permitted when they actually benefit the white institution or the white elites as well. And we're seeing that definitely the anti-racist gestures in football are definitely providing good sort of corporate image for the Premier League, even though they've now replaced the Black Lives Matter symbol on the jerseys with that quite sort of anodyne no room for racism. But alongside that sort of critical thinking, I also think about what that means. When I sat down in June and watched that first game after the restart, which was Aston Villa against Sheffield United, and on the television, of course, and saw the players do that. That was a sort of hairs on the back of the neck moment. You think about what's happened in the US and the absolute vitriol which has been meted out to Colin Kaepernick and others for doing this. To see 22 players and the officials do this, it was that powerful moment. And I think about, what it means to my, I talk about this with my nephew who's 10. And, when I was 10, this wasn't happening. Of course it wasn't. He's 10. I think about who he loves, and I'm going to give away who we both support now. He loves Richarlison, and he loves Dominic Calvert-Lewin, and he loves Andre Gomez. And they're his heroes. He's got them on his shirts. And to see those people doing that, at the age of 10, I think is incredibly powerful. So I'm critical in some ways of the kind of institutional mechanisms by which anti-racism can become sort of superficial and corporate in professional sport. But I also want us to retain a sense that these things are significant.
Yeah.
They are powerful, not least on the younger generations.
Yeah. Let's talk about football media treatment of black footballers. Raheem Sterling's had a really tough time in recent years with some papers, and then they've sort of flipped the other way when then he'll be outspoken about racism in the game for praising him to talk out about that kind of stuff. And then the other side is that Marcus Rashford at the moment is the nation's darling with his incredible work on free meals and the pressure he's put on the government. Do you think black players of wealth in general are treated differently to white players in a similar situation?
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt about it. I write quite a lot about Sterling in the book, in a number of senses. I mean, I think Sterling again has emerged as a really critically important spokesperson for the current generation of black footballers. If you'd asked me a couple of years ago who might this key spokesperson be, and I'm just talking about the men's game for the time being, I wouldn't have said Sterling. I didn't think that he was the player who was going to do that. But, he clearly has, and he's been a hugely important spokesperson and representative.
It flipped, didn't it? It flipped when it was the point, wasn't it? That it was a media story was it the same week or over a couple of weeks with completely different reactions to Tosin Adarabioyo and Phil Foden buying a house for their mum. That was it, wasn't it? And that was the moment where he said, I think he used the phrase that it was fueling racism. That was the moment that he really started to come to the fore with really pushing his views on on racism in the game.
Yeah, it was incredible, and that came in an Instagram post. That's another interesting, the way in which players are using their own personal platforms. But yeah, Sterling's been, I mean, it's a kind of perverse level and scope of the way in which Sterling is demonized, because he's demonized for at times seeming to be too kind of thrifty. He gets demonized in the papers for shopping at Primark or going to Greg's Bakery.
EasyJet flight, I think, was another one, wasn't it?
EasyJet flight, exactly, yeah. And he also gets hugely criticised for perceiving to being too sort of profligate with his funds. And the whole thing around buying houses was part of that. And there's some wonderful parts of Sterling's charitable life. He supported at the funeral of a young Crystal Palace footballer, Damari Dawkins, who died as a teenager. He gave away a lot of free tickets to schools in his old school in the borough of Brent when Manchester City were playing in the cup final. Last week or so, we saw a very, very similar sort of framing as what happened with Sterling, and juxtaposed against Phil Foden and Tosin Adarabioyo, where Rashford was reported to be buying some houses, and the same kind of racist framing came out, quite soon after that happened. So it's the ways in which black footballers are spoken about and spoken to, both in the media and in the social media, we must also remember, is a way of social control and a form of the kind of machinery of racism, which is saying to black footballers fundamentally, in inverted commas, know your place. Play football, be good, win us games, but don't start throwing your money around or things like that. And that's an ingrained racial stereotype around which has been levelled at black communities for a long time.
Dan, the book sounds really interesting. We'll put all the links in the podcast description. Thanks so much for talking about it. It'd be really looking forward to getting stuck into that. Now, we end every podcast with some questions away from your work. It's just a bit of fun. So the first one is, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the advice would simply be to my younger self would be, appreciate all the trophies Everton are winning, because they're not going to happen again for quite a while.
It could be changing soon. You play it's a lot better this season.
Thank you, Richard. I hope so, and it's going to be perhaps a real irony and a sad situation that we'll win something this season, and I won't be there to see it. But fingers crossed that things change and we get in the ground soon, and we get back to healthy, safe society.
Absolutely, looking good, looking more positive. If you could study any other course at Brighton, what would it be?
Oh, I mean, that's a great question, because I'm so in awe of. I've got so many great colleagues across the institution who teach such interesting stuff. I think it would be probably something that maybe around some of the human geography, or film studies, or the elements of humanities that look at American history, things like that. Mm-hmm. And as someone who studied sport as an undergraduate and postgraduate, I don't want to underplay my own or talk down what myself and my colleagues do in our own department. But no, I would love to do some of those other sort of humanities and social science things.
Yeah, great. And can you pick a favourite place in Sussex?
I love listening to the other podcasts you do on this, and I'm always intrigued by what people answer here. Now, I was born in Brighton, and I've lived in Brighton all my life, apart from my time away at university. So that's a very, very challenging question. I live in Brighton I would go quite specific, and I grew up in Patcham in the north of Brighton, and so it's probably places like the walk up to the Chattery on the Downs, Stanmer Park. It's those places which have such fond memories for me as a young person, and I can enjoy those outdoor spaces with family now. So I would say those parts of Brighton. Yeah.
Great. Tell us something about yourself that a lot of people may not know.
Ooh, yeah, I spend a lot of time writing about sport, but I'm just as much a music fan. I'm a huge music fan, and I particularly like going to places which have significant sort of musical folklore or related to the music industry. And I'm very, very fortunate to have been able to visit a number of, for me, really significant music studios. So I've been to Motown in Detroit, I've been to Stax in Memphis, and I've been to Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And the great experiences for me, the first two are quite touristy to go to those studios, but the latter, which is perhaps the least well known, is Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals, and that's a very, very hands-on experience. We were very lucky when we visited those studios that the Blind Boys of Alabama were recording at the time in the studio. I'm not a musician, but I do try and play the guitar. I was able to pick up and play Jimmy Johnson's guitar. Jimmy Johnson's probably not that well known, but he was part of the Swampers. And if you're listening to Aretha Franklin, Wilson Pickett, Clarence Carter, you're hearing Jimmy Johnson's guitar on those records. So yeah, I'm a huge music fan, and I love to go to those kind of places where the music was created, which gives me so much happiness now.
Great. And if you could invite 3 people to dinner, excluding family, past or present, who would they be and why?
Yeah, well, I've given the game away a bit for those who don't know me, that I'm a Everton season ticket holder. Everton's such an important part of my life. So I didn't say that about the question, what do people not know about you? Because anyone who's come within minutes of meeting me will know this. So, and if I was having dinner, I'm sure the conversation would move to football and Everton quite quickly. So I would invite 3 people who've played for Everton. I would firstly invite Cliff Marshall. Cliff was one of the first black footballers in England in the early 70s, and he was the first locally born black footballer to play for the Everton men's team. He wasn't the first player of colour to play for Everton. Mike Trebilco played in the 60s, although Trebilco doesn't identify as a multiracial person. And there were some guest players from Chinese players earlier in the century. But Cliff was the first player to come from Liverpool, from Liverpool 8 neighbourhood in South Liverpool. And I'd want to talk to him and hear his stories about that role. And then to bring it more up to date, I would like to invite Valerie Govan, who is top player for the Everton women's side. She's a decorated French international, born on the Pacific island of Reunion. And I'd really want to hear about her experiences as a woman representing Everton, and as a black woman in English football at what is really a very pivotal time for the women's game. And the last one would be my hero, Big Neville Southall. Nev was my hero growing up. He was the best goalkeeper in the world. He was incredible, and he was my sort of hero as a player. But he was also very significant in supporting the fanzine when Skies Are Grey, the Everton fanzine. He was very significant in supporting their anti-racism campaign in the 1990s, and he's now gone on to become a really, really important advocate and ally for trans communities and sexual minorities and other movements for social justice. I was very lucky to meet him once. I've never been so nervous in my life. I've stood up and lectured in front of eminent colleagues and students and large audiences, but I was never quite as nervous as when I bumped into Neville Southall and had the chance to speak to him. So I would, invite those 3 Evertonians who have been key players, but also really important in our understanding of anti-racism and social justice in the game.
Brilliant. That would be a great little dinner party, I think. Thanks so much for coming on, Dan. Great to speak to you. Best of luck with the book. And as I say, we'll put the links in this podcast description. That's it for this podcast. But please do share on social media if you can, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening.